you're in the space business just like I am. And so people have to think about what happens if there's a disruption in space innovation and technology. But the other side of that is for those great entrepreneurs out there, you're here to solve those problems. So if you're a great problem solver, you're excited about making sure that space or other technology remains stable and secure, there's a great opportunity for you.
Hello, welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host and fellow strategist, Jeff Hyatt. This is your go-to spot for real talk with the masterminds of business strategy. It's about sharing stories, insights, and those little nuggets of wisdom to help you unlock big growth. Let's turn the key and spring into action.
Welcome to the Big Strategy Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Hyatt, and we're joined today by Shelli Brunswick. Shelli is a space industry veteran, and what really struck me about her the first time we met was that she was that bridge connecting the space ecosystem to business here on Earth. And I was just really surprised by all those connections. And so I had to have her on the show, and we're honored to have her here. So Shelli, thank you for joining us today on the podcast.
It's my honor to be joining you and to share how space is part of our everyday lives.
That's really why we're here, is to learn more. I look up and I see the stars, but there's a lot more going on, which I know you'll tell us about. But before we get into that, I always start with the most difficult question, and that is, please introduce yourself.
Absolutely. I like to break my journey into chapters because I've been in the space business and the aerospace business more than 35 years. So I'm going to go back to that first chapter when I enlisted in the U.S. Air Force right out of high school. And similar to some of your audience members, it was because I didn't really know what I wanted to study when I went to college. I didn't have college money, and I wanted to see the world. And in the 1980s, the best way to see the world was to join the military. So I enlisted in the Air Force, and they stationed me in Turkey and Germany and Colorado and LA and DC. So it was a great opportunity to see not only the world, but the United States. They made me a personnel specialist. So they gave me a career field and I got to learn a discipline. So I'm actually an HR person from the beginning, but we'll get there. And then the other great part was I was able to take advantage of a great thing they have called tuition assistance, which allowed me to go to school at night and complete both my bachelor's and master's degrees. And that allowed me to apply to become an officer in the Air Force, which started my second chapter of my journey, which is my space chapter. Because when the Air Force made me an officer, they made me a space acquisition officer. So that started that journey. I did space acquisition and procurement. So I was the person who did the overseeing of contractors to buy satellites and launch vehicles and ground stations. I taught at Defense Acquisition University about space acquisition and program management, and I culminated my career in the Air Force working on Capitol Hill as a budget and appropriation liaison. So I secured the budget for the Air Force so they could execute all their programs. When I retired from the Air Force, I started that third chapter of my journey, which was going to work at the Space Foundation as their chief operating officer. And that was an amazing experience to lead a high caliber team that put on one of the global space conferences known around the world, which is called Space Symposium. They also do educational programs, kindergarten through 12th grade, teacher professional development, entrepreneurial facilitation. So it's a great opportunity to lead profit and loss, P&Ls, lead an amazing team, as well as take my military space and complement it with civil, commercial, and international. And then just in 2024, I launched my own company called SB Global LLC, which is the chapter I'm in today and that we're talking about. And that's about how I can be the bridge from the space ecosystem to the general public.
The unicorns or billionaire companies get the headlines, but it's really those folks like yourself with deep expertise who see a need in the market to connect to disparate disciplines, if you will. In this case, space and Earth. While they seem disparate, there's really a lot aligned in that. And so when we talk about business models here on Earth all the time, are business models different in space, or is there something unique to that space ecosystem that either attracted you to this space or you think is the opportunity in space?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to give you two answers, one from the military hat I wore, and then one for entrepreneurs here on Earth. So from the military perspective, when we normally did procurement in the military, you would think of buying multiple replicas. So you'd buy tanks or aircrafts, and you'd buy many. And so your biggest expense was not in the beginning of buying the acquisition. It was at the end, all the sustainment cost. Space is different, especially for the military, when you're looking at launching a vehicle into space. So your expenses are more in the front because once you launch into orbit, you're not going to be able to service it. Now, let's put a pin in that because we're going to come back and talk about the future of space and servicing in space. But when I was doing it, you could not service it. So a lot of your expense was in the beginning because you had to test and validate that your satellite was going to work, because once it's up there, you're done. It's a sunk cost. So a very different procurement model than tanks and airplanes. Now, as we pivot to today and we're looking at the commercialization of space, you are now seeing companies that are going to do satellite servicing, refueling satellites, maybe manufacturing in space, taking defunct satellites and maybe reconfiguring them into new satellites. So there is a different model that's taking place. We're not there yet. That's probably several more years off, and we can talk about where we are in the various stages of space acquisition or space entrepreneurship, but there is going to be an opportunity to resurface satellites in the future. For entrepreneurs here on Earth, if you're really thinking about being in the space business, you're no different than any other entrepreneur. There's a problem and you want to solve it, and you want your solution to be the best solution. And so, whether that's going to be launching a satellite, creating a rocket, or taking space technology and using it for benefit here on Earth, you are going to be a problem solver. And that's what's most important to remember.
In the discipline that I teach, design thinking, we really lean into this idea of there's got to be a better way. You don't have to have a solution to be an entrepreneur. You can have that sand in your shoe moment, as I like to call it, that you just look at something and say, there's got to be a better way. And so it sounds like, from your perspective, that's an opportunity that exists here on Earth.
Absolutely. So when we think about space, a lot of times what we're thinking about is going on to the moon, back to the moon, this time to stay, onto Mars and beyond. And that is certainly where a lot of our space entrepreneurs, visionaries are thinking. But I also want to pivot that to how space is benefiting us here on Earth. We took Apollo era technology that was developed for space and we transitioned it for Earth use. So one of my favorites is my husband was a firefighter for 30 years. And because of Apollo era space technology, fire retardant clothing, he was able to come home every night. We also have eye surgery. We know about laser surgery, but a lot of that technology was designed to track astronauts' eyes for space launch. So a lot of the technology we're using today and benefiting from came from the Apollo era. And in 2012, NASA estimated that they're investing every dollar is now worth more than that, than what came from Apollo era. And I'm going to go back. I believe it was $1 invested for Apollo was a $7 return. And now it was $1 is a $40 return. And so there's a lot of opportunity to take this space technology and commercialize it. So you don't have to be a space expert. You don't have to think about orbits and tilts and getting rockets into space. You can think about agriculture, healthcare, energy and energy storage solutions. And one great place for your folks to check out if they're interested is NASA has a great website called the NASA Technology Transfer Office. And there they've listed thousands of patents that are waiting for entrepreneurs to commercialize. And so what you can do for your amazing audience, for entrepreneurs and investors, go check out that website. If you see a patent you think you'd like to bring to market, you could apply for the patent. You can apply for a grant called an STTR, Space Technology Transfer Resource Grant. There's also a SBIR, Small Business Innovative Resource Grant. So you can get some grants to help you take that patent from technology readiness level 0 to about 3 or 4. Then you want to transition into an incubator or accelerator to help you get that through the valley of death and up and out and commercialization. So I'll pause there, but there's a lot of great technology that is just waiting for entrepreneurs and investors to commercialize at NASA right now that will benefit us right here on Earth.
The one thing that really struck me was the reframe that you provided in terms of the procurement piece, right? It's not the ongoing cost, it's the upfront cost of launching a rocket or launching a satellite. And hearing that, it made me reflect back to when we did that rescue mission to the Hubble telescope and we changed its glasses, if you will, in outer space. That was an incredible feat that was done, but that was an example of servicing in space. The reason why I say that was incredible is because people, I think, give government a bad rap. They think of taxes and they look at politicians and they think that's the government. But in reality, Government is one of the riskiest investors out there in that they adopt and incubate these frontier technologies. How important is the government in this role? And as an entrepreneur or someone incubating a new idea, how do I lean into that?
Space, for the most part, has been very risky. And what that means is there's really not a business case, right? The only customer was the government, right? Up until 2004, when Congress passed Commercial Crew, which allowed for commercial rockets, which that allowed SpaceX and all these companies. Up until then, you had to be a government contractor. You had to be in the contract of the government, NASA, the Air Force, et cetera, to even build, create, launch a rocket. So government is the leader. I know that probably sounds like an oxymoron to some of your audience, but government is the leader. They lead with
Yes.
policy and legislation. So if you think that policies or legislation are not beneficial, then you need to contact your representatives. You need to let them know how they need to improve regulations so that you can be a better entrepreneur. And one of those was, as I mentioned, in 2004, Congress passed the Commercial Crew. And what that allowed us to do was transition from government only launch vehicles to commercial application. And that gave rise to the SpaceX and Blue Origin and Rocket Lab and everything else. It all started with legislation. And not only did it start with legislation, it also started with funding, because what happened is NASA started giving contracts to help to nurture this environment. So if you're an entrepreneur in NASA or the Space Force or DARPA or another government agency is looking to lead in an area and pivot the industry into another area, look to where they're leading, because when they do that, legislation starts to allow that, but then also the seed funding that can help you be one of the early entrepreneurs that capture it, like SpaceX. And again, everybody sees SpaceX today. What a great success story. But for those of you who have a short memory or weren't around that long, SpaceX almost went out of business. They had multiple failures before they reached success, but they had a very different mind frame when it came to failure. Now, that's where it pivots different from the government.
Tell us more. This seems like a really critical point.
Absolutely. So, as I said, government is the leader, but government is also very risk averse. So, they like to finalize and redo and get all the way sometimes to 100% solution. Well, that burns a lot of time, schedule, and budget. So, for your program managers out there, the triangle, cost, schedule, and performance. So, the government likes 100% reliability. But what SpaceX did, and you're now seeing it with other space entrepreneurs, they're willing to have failures. They call them anomalies in the space business. We're willing to see something blow up, an anomaly, because what you can do is you can get great data from that. You can improve from that, and then you can accelerate much faster than trying to test and get all the risk out of something like the government will do. So the government is trying to take on more of a risk tolerance, but it is a challenge. You saw SpaceX do that. And I'll share with you more about a book I have coming up where I talk about we need to be more of risk takers as entrepreneurs. It's okay to fail. It's okay to try different things. Take failure, I call it FAIL, first attempt in learning.
And that's, I think, even entrepreneurs here in Silicon Valley can learn something from the space industry's playbook, and how, as you said, learning our way forward is another mindset that we use in design thinking. This concept of perfection is the enemy of progress. And at some point, obviously not when lives are at stake, but in the early process, as you're trying to tease out a technology or you're trying to tease out product market fit in a more nuanced setting, you have to take multiple iterations at that.
That's something we did in the military with spiral development, where you
Mm.
build, you test, maybe you tweak, you break, you test again. So look at that spiral development. I'm sure it's called something else today. What I've learned is very little changes, but we change the names to make it sound new. Spiral development or test and verification. And then we also can talk about, we have a lot of different technology today to help us test faster too with digital twin technology. You're seeing digital twin technology being used here on Earth, but also in space. We're looking at space situational awareness, which is tracking all the orbital debris that we have going around the planet. There's no way one person, one entity can do that. What they're looking at is how do you create digital twins of that orbital debris
Mm.
so that we can track it. That allows us to have better situational awareness and eventually create mitigation. And who are going to be the mitigators of orbital debris? Companies, entrepreneurs.
At the Berkeley Innovation Group, we are a strategy consultancy and AI advisory firm focused on mid-market companies looking to unlock big growth. In contrast to management consultants' typical top-down, hypothesis-driven approach, Big uses a curiosity-inspired, bottom-up approach, leveraging customer insights to drive strategy co-creation. Learn more about our approach by downloading our ebook at biginnovates.com/ebook. Now, back to the show.
This has been so fascinating, Shelli, and I want to unpack this a little bit more because you talk about legislation being passed in 2004, and yet we're in 2024. And of course, SpaceX is functioning and providing services to the government. But for the typical entrepreneur, it's going to be difficult to fund yourself over a 15 or 20 year realization cycle. And so in that case, maybe we can break this beast down into multiple pieces. And so if I am an executive today leading my company, I don't want to get laughed out of the boardroom by bringing up this idea of extending our business into the space ecosystem. So maybe look at it two ways, from an entrepreneur perspective, but also from an existing company as an executive. What are some of the initial opportunities, this downstream piece, as you referred to it, in the space industry?
I'm going to first start with some advice I gave Jamie Dimon at the World Economic Forum. You're already in the space business. So anybody listening to this webinar, you are already in the space business. You just don't know it. Now, with that, let's break it down into what are the near term, midterm, and far term looks at investing in space. And as you said, the immediate benefits where you're seeing investors and entrepreneurs being able to make money and generate revenue and TAM and grow is in taking space technology for Earth's benefit. So the downstream, we call it, that's applications here on Earth to the general public. So you can look at Earth observation. Weather data is really important for predicting weather. And that's important not only for you pulling up your phone saying, hey, what's the weather going to be like in sunny California today? But it's also really important for navigation, airplane travel, logistics, moving cargo, growing crops around the world. Being able to have what good weather prediction is critical for business. But we're also looking at other things, telecommunications. So you're looking at SpaceX also launching Starlink, and there's many other companies that are also looking at communication. And right now, there are vast parts of the world that we live in that do not have internet connectivity, especially remote islands around the equatorial region, because there's no way to lay fiber optic cable there. So just think about millions, actually it's billions of people that are not connected to the internet, to the web. They're not able to do business. They're not able to know weather predicting. They don't know a tsunami is coming. Having this type of infrastructure with SpaceX, OneWeb, and many others, creating satellite-based internet and communications will not only be beneficial for us here in America that are doing business or traveling to Antarctica, but it's going to bring in billions of people into the global space ecosystem. It's going to close that digital divide and allow more people to become better off with that technology. So those are some of the applications. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not just those satellites that are providing services. It's also taking the technology transfer that we learned from space that can have an application. And so some people don't think about Airbnb and Uber, but think about it. Airbnb, Uber, the banking system, our entire financial system, those are all running on the infrastructure of space. Think about if we didn't have GPS, when you go and pull out money out from the ATM, there's a date timestamp on there from a GPS satellite. It's the first form of blockchain. That's how we know that transaction was legitimate from an ATM machine. But think about Uber and Airbnb. You couldn't make that reservation to get an Airbnb or order Uber Eats without GPS satellites. So there's a lot of opportunity where entrepreneurs don't need to know about space. They don't even need to care about space. They can think of space as like the roads. It's an infrastructure to create a business. The mail system is an infrastructure. So how can you use that infrastructure to create products and services that benefit us? Another one I like to highlight is our agriculture. They can use precision agriculture, which is actually using GPS satellites to plow the fields, lay the crops, and harvest the crops, which increase crop production by 10%. Again, John Deere didn't have to launch satellites, but putting that GPS tracker on the John Deere tractors to create precision agriculture is a benefit. Again, go to that NASA Tech Transfer Office, thousands of patents that relate to things that you wouldn't even think are part of the space industry.
That's such a great point. And I go back to when we used the business model canvas in some early iterations of an idea as we're teasing it out. And on the far left side, they have the partners column. And I can tell you, no one's ever put space or space related companies in that. They never list GPS as a core technology, but it really is. Clearly, most executives realize that some level of their business runs on data from space. And I want to just get back to, does an executive need a space portion of their business plan? Are there risks associated with space that they've outsourced to their vendors but could be critical to their business? Is this something that IT departments should be looking at on a more tactical level? Just as an executive today, how do I make sure my bases are covered as it relates to things I may take for granted, frankly, that there's an active GPS signal?
Let's start with yes. Everything you said is a yes. Yes. So let's go back to that conversation at the World Economic Forum with Jamie Dimon. What happens if GPS goes down? What happens if orbital debris crashes into a GPS satellite? What happens to our banking and financial system? What is the backup? Right now, everything is automated. Think about it. All of you have statements. Do any of you print your statements every day? Do they come in the mail like they used to in the old days? No, they're all online. So if GPS went down, what happens to all your banking transactions and the backup? So our banks, financial institutions doing a backup. So it's more than just an IT department. Absolutely, it should be an IT department, but it's really a risk mitigation strategy that board of directors should be thinking about, because if you're in any kind of online platform business, you're in a business that could be impacted if space is impacted. Because again, just like the road system or the postal service, you're not thinking about it, but it is running in the background of the infrastructure of your business. If you're Airbnb and Uber, what happens if those GPS satellites go down? What happens if somebody spoofs the system or is able to jam the GPS signal? So that's part of, like you said, why are other governments looking to create a backup to GPS? That's why, because GPS could go down, GPS could be jammed, as could any of those other signals. So they're looking at aircraft now having more than one responder, and I'm just going to call it GPS because it's PNT, precision navigation and timing. But that's what we want to have is we want to have multiple PNTs, because one could go down, one could be jammed, one could have misinformation. And so many of our systems, it's not, think about aircrafts, but think about all our food. Like I had a banana today. I know that wasn't grown here in Colorado. That was shipped here from somewhere else, and that shipping company is using GPS or PNT to move that cargo from wherever to the port of Los Angeles, and then it's getting on a truck and it's coming to Colorado. Our entire ecosystem of transportation like that is running on space technology. So think about during COVID when we had the ports and all the port problems of moving infrastructure and cargo around during COVID. We know in LA there was a big backlog of unloading at the docks. Think about if GPS goes down for all those shipping containers, because that's how we're moving global commerce these days. So that's probably a long answer to an even longer answer, but I think it's something that every board should be thinking about, every executive should be thinking about, and it's more than just your IT department. It's really about risk mitigation.
We get back to this concept of a black swan event. And if for some reason the global GPS system goes down, even if it's from a malicious act or even one satellite gets disrupted, that's going to disrupt commerce here on Earth. Again, you don't want to have to go to your board and say, we didn't anticipate this.
It's just like a cyber attack. If your
Yeah.
company is not preparing for cyber attacks, for phishing schemes, for somebody to steal your data and make it public in the dark web, if your company is not doing that, then your company and your board is not doing their due diligence and their oversight. Same thing with space. It is the same type of risk mitigation that needs to be taken because, as I just said, if you're in business, you're in the space business. You and I are right now doing this over telecommunications was designed by the space industry to communicate with astronauts. So this whole platform of technology of telecommunications, telehealth, teleschool, work from home, all came from the space industry, and we're running this using telecommunications, space technology, and that infrastructure. If this went down, we wouldn't even be able to do this webinar. I'd probably have to go to a studio somewhere, or we'd do a phone interview. Think about how we'd go back to analog and how you do all these interviews.
Yeah, you would be recording it in a studio and mailing me a tape or some sort of right analog recording, and then we'd be cutting that up, and yeah, it would be, and then we wouldn't even be able to post it as a podcast because we wouldn't have the digital means to do that.
Exactly. Somebody have to go to a movie theater or something to see it. And there's probably people today listening to this, not even knowing what we're talking about, big
No idea.
schools and media and stuff, how we did things in the olden days,
The
you know.
olden
So
days. That's
again,
right.
you're in the space business just like I am. And so people have to think about what happens if there's a disruption in space innovation and technology. But the other side of that is for those great entrepreneurs out there, you're here to solve those problems. So if you're a great problem solver, you're excited about making sure that space or other technology remains stable and secure, there's a great opportunity for you.
100% correct. And with that being said, whenever I hear infrastructure business, I always think of that infrastructure moves to a commodity business. And once, for example, weather data is ubiquitous, traffic data is ubiquitous, etc., and I can get it for free. The net new investment in weather per se is not something that as an entrepreneur I would take on. Now, would I take on new applications of weather data here on Earth? Absolutely. Which is interesting that Elon Musk chose to enter that business with Starlink. But I think he had a little bit different perspective in that he was able to do it at such a scale that it could disrupt the status quo. And so, just a note to listeners from a strategy perspective, when you're thinking about it, understand the existing scale. What's the margin? Has it been commoditized? Can you reach that scale to play? And when it's folks like Elon Musk's or global governments that are making these investments, it may be a difficult place for an entrepreneur. Now, that being said, you talked about entrepreneurs engaging in this mid-range activities. And so I'm completely excited about the idea of a service station in space. I feel like it's something that should be in a Disney movie. I'm like picturing going to Cars Land in Disneyland, but then actually that being for space. So what is this opportunity to be this service station or this debris reclamation sort of company in this environment?
So there's a lot of companies that are doing some great work. Like I said, Orbit Fab, they're creating gas stations in space. What is that gas? Certain fuel mix that you can put those in space, the fuel, so you can launch the fuel, and then you'll have these other satellites that can get the fuel and then link up with a satellite to refuel it. So it's not necessarily maybe the satellite coming to the gas station in space, but it's a bridge. The other thing is you're looking at companies maybe launching a net to capture the orbital debris and then deorbit it. So there's a lot of things that we need to do because, as I said, space is getting very congested, competitive. The other side of it is there's a lot of debris, space situational awareness, but that creates great opportunities for companies like Slingshot Aerospace and others to look at ways that they can create situational awareness of what's happening in space so that they can look at where is some of this orbital debris that's not functioning satellites. How could we then, iSpace and other companies, look at deorbiting defunct pieces? So there's a lot of great opportunities. The other thing is manufacturing in space. One of my great friends, Dr. Nicole Wagner, she's in the healthcare industry. And what her company is doing called Lambda Vision is she's creating a lens for your eye to replace your lens due to macular degeneration. Now, most people may not know what macular degeneration is, but as we age, sometimes people go blind, and there's no cure right now for this. And what she's done, again, she's a doctor, she's in the healthcare industry, the biotech, but she's partnered with NASA and Space Tango and the International Space Station. And what she's doing is she's 3D printing that lens, that protein lens in space. Why? Because the macro environment that space offers is a better way to 3D print something that's a lens replacement, the way the protein lays, and it's layers of protein that create that lens, and it's a better product doing it in space, reduces the waste. Now, so she's not a space person, she's a doctor, but she's using space because it's a better means of bringing her product to market. And so there's a lot of other healthcare applications, whether it's looking at bringing to market pharmaceuticals or healthcare. We can do a lot more of that in space. And the International Space Station's pretty small. It doesn't have a lot of opportunity to do a lot of this work, and we're going to decommission it in 2030. So there's this great opportunity, ding, ding, another opportunity for entrepreneurs out there, that NASA is releasing contracts to companies to look at replacing space stations, and these would be commercial space stations. So this is the similar model of what they did with rockets. They did all the rockets, then they created the opportunity for commercial companies. They did contracts, SpaceX, etc. Now they're doing the exact same thing for space stations. And space stations will be similar to a mall. So you go to the mall, you've got a couple anchor tenants, maybe it's Macy's or Nordstrom's. The government will be one of those anchor tenants on that space station. They'll like rent, own a part of it. That's where their astronauts can go and they can do their government activities. But the rest of the space station, which is commercial now, can be done for commercial activities. So similar to Dr. Wagner, there could be a lot of other companies, Bayer, that might want to do experiments in pharmaceutical development in space to bring products to market faster. And then if you add artificial intelligence to bringing these products to market faster, so you got space and AI, because right now it can take over 10 years to bring a healthcare application to market. Between space technology and AI, you could bring that to market faster, which could save more lives.
As we say in design thinking, design at the extreme to test at the mean. And clearly, manufacturing in space as a whole is probably not profitable or even feasible at this point. But when you go to the extreme and you find these use cases that require a certain level of precision that can't be found here on Earth, that's really where these broader reframes or structural changes take place. Is they're whispers at the edge, but then as they gain steam, they become more mainstream. And so I think it's very natural to say if I run a waste management company, to say going to space and collecting garbage or space junk, whatever you want to call it, isn't a profitable business. I can understand why they wouldn't say that today if they have quarterly or annual goals that they need to reach. That said, it's a place where the industry is going, the space industry is going, and the government's clearly, as you said, subsidizing that through research grants, etc. Is that how does a company who's has an existing line of business that they need to stay dedicated to, how can they put one or two or more chips on these startup or longer range ideas? What would be your recommendation?
I want to pull the idea that I shared about manufacturing in space. So NASA has a theme called Make It, Don't Take It. So we're at a point where we need to stop taking resources from Earth for space. Water. First of all, getting off the planet is the biggest expense, breaking the gravity and getting out of Earth's gravity. So that's where we're spending a lot of money. So for every pound. So what can we not take? Water. We know the moon has water now. Mars has water. There are asteroids that have water, but there's also energy on the moon with helium-3. So NASA's philosophy for going forward as we become an interplanetary species and go back to the moon and onto Mars is we need to make it there, not take it. So we really need to look at this AI, robotics, virtual reality, and how we can do not only manufacturing in low Earth orbit, but how do we take that on to the moon? There's a company in Texas that is 3D printing homes here on Earth, but they've also received a contract from NASA to 3D print things on the moon. And they probably could be a company that will eventually 3D print on Mars. I'm going to tell you, if you're in waste management, and I appreciate you picking up my trash yesterday, thank you so much, great service. You might want to be thinking about what's the next level of waste management. Are you only going to be on Earth or do you want to be on the moon and Mars? What's next? Because waste management companies could invest in potential waste management in space, orbital debris. And then do they capture it? Do they combine it? Do they sell it to a manufacturer who's got a space station up there? And does a company buy it and then remanufacture it in space? And then it gets reused, sold here on Earth, right? Bitcoin transactions, whatever, and it's used on the moon and Mars or other space stations. We really need to think big picture. And companies And boards, I'm on several boards, are probably thinking big picture. Again, does waste management company need to be thinking about waste management in space? It probably should be on their radar, but it's probably not a big piece. But eventually, they may want to evaluate what's the next step. It's similar to oil and gas industry. Who would think the oil and gas industry would now be part of carbon capture? So we do need to think that way. We do need to think about traditional companies that are seen in one light being open to being more broad, just like we're looking at the pivot from oil and gas industries being able to become carbon capture companies now.
What I really appreciate about what you shared was this concept of returning something to Earth that's of value but may not be physical.
Because we're still here on Earth. All this stuff that's happening in space, the workforce, the people, the jobs, the economic development is here. NASA's jobs are here on Earth. So you could be a worker on a space station, but you go to your office or maybe you just go to your office in your house and you put on your 3D vision goggles and it's all virtual reality. You may not be in that space station. You might. Eventually we will have a cislunar and a gateway is going to be orbiting the moon where astronauts or workers could go down to a research center and go back to gateway. So there will be
Wow.
real people in space, but not to the extent that we will see millions of people. The jobs and the economic development for companies that are listening to this, entrepreneurs, is still here on Earth. Waste management, oil and gas, you're going to make money here on Earth. You're going to grow revenue and TAM and profit shares for your board of directors and your stock owners. I'm a stock owner as well, so we like to see that. But you're going to create and change because if you do not innovate, you will be left behind. I like to watch Jim Cramer on CNBC. So, for any of your audience who enjoys him, he interviews a lot of CEOs. And one of the companies he's talked about is Nike. And we've seen, and this will date your episode to 2024, is Nike over the last couple of years from COVID has lost their innovation pipeline. And Nike was always innovative. And so
Yes.
that's part of where they've lost that innovation. So your companies need to be thinking about space. It is the next step. It is not the final frontier. It is the next frontier. And if they're not thinking about it, they're not going to be innovating for products, programs, services that could be in space, but still benefit and generate economic development on Earth.
So, with that, that's a very compelling perspective in terms of why we need to make that investment and be aware of what potentially lies ahead for our business and society as a whole, frankly, as we won't even get into the political ramifications of us down here and them up there.
I'm just going to say, I like to say we're humanity. So it's
Yeah.
all of us, whether we're here on Earth, we're on the moon or Mars or space stations in between. We as humanity are going to become an interplanetary species.
So, tell us that story. What is your dream or vision for what it looks like when humans reach Mars?
What I'm going to share with you is I know a great author named Dr. Jack Gregg, and he ran the California Launch Facility. It's what would an economy look like that's separated, right? We've got an Earth economy, we might have a moon economy, and what would a Mars economy look like? And then how could they be integrated? And again, at the bottom, at the end of all of this, it is about profits, right? Because our economy is run by businesses that generate economic development that create jobs. So what I'm going to do is I don't want to steal Dr. Jack's thunder, but I do recommend that book on the cosmic economy. But every company, every entrepreneur out there, think about how you're already part of the space industry. If you're thinking of a concept, how could space help you advance it and take it to the next level? Take a look at the NASA Tech Transfer website, the DARPA, the Department of Energy. All of these government agencies have patents that are waiting to be commercialized. Get into a great incubator that can help you connect with governments, especially in space. Like I said, don't fight the Fed, don't fight the government when it's investing in space. So like I said, the next tranche of investments, space situational awareness, orbital debris mitigation, space stations. That's going to be that next tranche, 3 to 5 years. How can you be part of that next wave? And then there'll be another wave. But right now, see where the government's investing money, get into those incubators, look at creating opportunities. And for individuals out there who are just like, hey, I just want to create a really cool thing that solves a problem for people, there might be a way to do that with the space infrastructure. Like I love Uber. I never get a rental car anymore. Who would have thought Uber would disrupt this market like this? But again, if it weren't for space technology, Uber could not run their platform. So what are some great technologies that could disrupt the ecosystem? Because there's a great saying, if you don't disrupt yourself, you will be disrupted.
Shelli, tell us more about how we can sync up with your work, follow you. And I hear you have not just a book, but a book series forthcoming. So please tell us more.
Absolutely. The book series is called What Space Got to Do with It? And the genesis was I did a TEDx talk 2 years ago, and I talked about what space has to do with it. A lot of the things we've talked about, tech transfer, opportunities for people to be part of the space industry. We didn't get into that so much, but 60 years ago, you were pretty much a government worker, a male, a STEM professional. Now, pretty much anybody can be in the space industry. Marketing, artists, entertainers. I hear Tom Cruise is going to space to do a movie. So anybody can be in the space industry. So what space got to do with it is going to be a book series. The first book is going to come out in a few months, and it's going to be 10 life lessons for personal growth. Now, what I did for this series is I interviewed over 200 global thought leaders. Now, they could have been in government. Some of them were former presidents of countries, all the way to young entrepreneurs. They were in policy making, they were in industry. They're from around the world, men and women. So I provided some great role models and success stories for individuals to follow. So each book will have interviews from 30 global thought leaders, as well as a little bit about my journey and story into the space industry, and then some great takeaways and how you can take the next step, how you can take those inspirations and transform them into action. So I hope you'll check out that first book. I also do some keynote speeches on it. I have been invited to go speak in Australia at a variety of high schools and universities to talk about the space industry. We'll talk about life lessons for personal growth. And then the next book that will come out next year is going to be called An Interstellar Guide to Success. So it's how I share how you can accomplish your goals and success story. I do use space examples, but the application is for anyone. And then the third book in the series will be called Out of This World Leadership. And it's the type of leaders we need today, not only for the space industry, but in general, because the world has changed drastically and we really need to be global transformational leaders.
That's just a wonderful reframe from a strategic perspective with some really important examples of how, in the short term, all companies rely on space, how in the medium term, the opportunities exist for gas stations and orbital debris, and then the long term, and how are we going to think of manufacturing and being self-sustaining in these extraorbital bodies like the moon or even Mars. So I think you've laid it out and given us a great perspective on that. So Shelli, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the Big Strategy Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's been such an honor. And until next time, I look forward to seeing you around the galaxy.